Welcome everyone to the CGHE seminar with the magic number of 191 and about our 60th in the webinar format. Today we're returning again to the question of the geopolitical space that higher education and research are operating in. And on Tuesday we heard from Jerry Postiglione, and he talked to us about how an emerging bipolar world divided between the United States and China has the potential to influence mobility flows, institutional collaboration, research, and so on. Today, Marijk van der Wende is going to bring forward a picture which adds to that picture of US-China tension with a focus on multipolarity, the emergence of Europe as a significant player as well, alongside the big powers in China and the US. And understanding the contemporary world, I think, means trying to deal with these two dynamics, the dynamic of a potential bipolarity between the two largest powers in higher education now, but Europe being equally important in aggregate as each of those also being a player, and of course the rest of the world, the other regions, the other major countries also in the mix. So we may not, after all, be dragged back to the 1950s and the Sino-Soviet rivalry. We may in fact have a world in which Europe is a significant player and others as well, and that modifies that bipolar picture. But Marijk will take us through those different angles and tensions, and particularly, I think, focus on East Asia. Before I introduce her, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Webinar is being recorded, will be posted online in the CG website in the next 48 hours or so. It's on YouTube for all time. As long as there's a YouTube, there's CG webinars. Each one of them are out there. And a transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted on our website. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question during the Q&A part. There's no need to have your video on, but it's not nice if you can turn it on before you ask a question in the Q&A section. We recommend using speaker view setting in Zoom because it enables you to see who's speaking at any given time. Now, to ask a question, and we really welcome questions from you, write your question down, put it in the chat. And it's on the basis of the questions that are posted in the chat that I compose the Q&A list as we go forward. And it's a good idea to post your question early because interesting questions that come up in the last 5 minutes often miss out on being heard. Now, when you're invited in to ask your question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. And as I often say, everyone forgets the last one, but it's a good idea to introduce yourself as you start to speak. Now, our speaker today is one of the most important and distinguished scholars of higher education in the last 2 decades. Marijk van der Wende is now a distinguished faculty professor of higher education at Utrecht in the Faculty of Law, Economics and Governance. She's a member of the advisory board of the Centre for Global Higher Education that hosts these webinars. Her work on internationalisation and globalisation has been front rank for a long time and is much used by our doctoral students at Oxford, I notice. She's got a wide range of interests and capabilities across higher education studies. She's had distinguished visiting faculty roles around the world at Berkeley, at Shanghai Jiaotong, and she's a member of the International Advisory Board of the Shanghai ranking, the academic ranking of world universities, and of the Graduate School of Education at Shanghai. So she knows China. She visits China quite often. She's very much entrenched in Europe and knows the United States very well as well. And when I was in Australia, she appeared there to conduct a substantial research program. She's very well engaged in the sector. Marijk, it's really a pleasure to invite you in now, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much. Dear colleagues, hello everybody. I hope you're doing well. Here in the Netherlands, we're hoping for the reopening of our universities, for more vaccine, and for the spring. And of course, for a return to a more steady and safer world. We all share these hopes, I think, and I hope that the eventual progress will also be shared. And that's a test of solidarity, both in Europe as well as globally. And as said in the announcement of this session, it's early to assess the full impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and of the shifting geopolitics on higher education. As Simon said, from Jerry Postiglione's seminar that I also had the pleasure to attend on Tuesday, we're moving the discussion from a bipolar to the multipolar view, bringing Europe and the Eurasian relation into the quotation. And I think, yeah, that's the question we're looking at indeed. Are we returning to a bipolar or moving towards a multipolar world? And who will be our peers then in research and higher ed? Who will share or reshape our market logic, our governance principles, our democratic and academic values? Well, since the start of this year, we're hearing world leaders reconfirming multilateralism. President Xi called for a return to multilateralism combined with his vision on global governance at the World Economic Forum, end of January, the first one ever online economic forum. And President Biden announced America is back and the transatlantic alliance is back at the G7 mid-February, calling for a coalition of democratic states against the threats from autocratic regimes, he said. And EU leaders, Merkel and Macron, responded with measured enthusiasm, mentioning effective multilateralism and referring to strategic autonomy, a concept which is now quite central to the policies of the European Commission and which also affects higher education and research. Strategic autonomy may also reflect the relationship with the US, as well as with China, and higher education may be concerned in both cases. I will talk about concerns in relation to surveillance states, China, as well as surveillance capitalism, US big tech. Anyway, not directly a warm welcome back for the US and Europe, perhaps. European Union being skeptical. How fast can trust be rebuilt? The US was annoyed that the EU signed a new trade deal, the investment agreement with China, just before the new US administration took office, while the former declared that China is committing genocide against Uyghur minorities in Xinjiang just before leaving office. Canadian Parliament last week made a similar statement. The EU has not sent such a signal to China. Prime Minister Johnson, ex-EU, who hosted the G7, is more enthusiastic, it seems, about the renewed US outreach, but also engaged in a complex relationship with China, offering citizenship to Hong Kong Chinese, but blocking Huawei to build 5G networks in the UK, and I think also encountering difficulties in signing a trade agreement with China over political controversies in the UK regarding the situation in Xinjiang. So the cards are being reshuffled. So how will the EU position itself? Europe has to balance economic and security interests in relation to both China and Russia. It has a transatlantic security alliance, NATO, with the US, not with China. But China is its largest trading partner. So I think the EU-China relation cannot be seen separately from the EU-US one. I'll try after this introduction to share my screen with you. All right. Seems to work. Can you confirm, Simon?
Yes, it's
all right. Okay. So in positioning itself in this complex global landscape for the EU, it seems to me that three things, at least three things, matter. First of all, the EU will need to stand together. And for that, the China relationship is not always helpful, not quite. China cooperates on a bilateral basis with some 18 Central and Eastern European countries, the CEC 17+1 it's called. And that potentially destabilizes the situation. And higher education may be implied. I will speak in particular about Hungary. Yet during the last summit with these countries that President Xi hosted early this month, these countries were showing less interest and various heads of government were absent. Chinese proposals were rejected. Maybe they were disappointed about China's delivery on projects and loans, also became more afraid of Russia and thus leaning more towards the US again. Meanwhile, both China and Russia continue COVID diplomacy in that region. After face masks, they are now offering affordable vaccine. And also in higher education and R&D, the EU needs to stand together, needs consistent policies. And I'll explain how complex that is in higher education, which is an acclaimed responsibility of the individual member states, their sovereignty, and in relation to third countries, such as China, since the EU has no common foreign policy, but it has a strong trade policy. Secondly, what also matters, in order to face the future, I think Europe is forced to look deeper into its history, including the colonial phase. It dominated the world for over 5 centuries and conquered some 80% of it. But that period is over. So we have to look at the future and this relationship in a different perspective. Europe is still the world's most important trade bloc, holding over 25% of global imports and exports. But in December 2020, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, was signed, a multilateral pact that includes the 10 nations of ASEAN, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and China. And in terms of exports, it's already larger than the EU and certainly in its share of the world GDP. And that refers to the third and probably most important point for the EU. In facing the future, it's facing decline. In terms of its share of world GDP, from its current 15 to an expected 9%, and in 2050, and by then also in terms of its share of the world population, sharing also to less than 10%. Hence the importance of the Eurasian relationship. So what are the implications for higher education? Well, clearly the patterns of globalization are changing, economic power shifting eastwards. Asia is becoming a real important force in global higher ed. A quarter of the world's best universities is expected to be Asian by 2040, and China is clearly emerging as a third scientific global player. But there's still a lot of open questions. How will the EU deal with China as a competitor or as a partner? And what will then be the conditions for international collaboration between universities for open science? I think the university side, we need to think about the nature of our partnerships, which academic standards we need to sustain and which values to defend. And most importantly, I think we need to think about how we prepare our students for this 21st century world. So let's take a quick look at how we got here in this relationship. This is a very brief summary. There is a more extensive one in the book that I'm speaking from, and that was co-edited with Simon Marginson and our colleagues, Bill Kirby from Harvard and Nan Chaoyu from Shanghai Jiaotong University. These relationships, of course, they go centuries back, but the, let's say, contemporary history of this relationship started shortly after the establishment of the predecessor of the EU and the reopening of China after the Cultural Revolution. And the first Sino-European cooperation on science and technology was signed in '85 as part of an agreement on trade and economic cooperation. And throughout the decades, the cooperation was built up along agreements, partnerships, lots of dialogues, ever more intense and ever more comprehensive. An important moment when the European Research Council and the National Science Foundation China signed an agreement and then continued in joint programming initiatives and continued to present results and further plans at summits. Importantly, though, is the shift towards a more globally competitive agenda in Europe around 2000. We remember the Lisbon agenda when research and development became an integral part of this agenda on the knowledge economy. And a kind of similar move that China made 15 years later when it integrated its R&D policy in its global strategy called or labeled the New Silk Road or Belt and Road Initiative. So even though global competition became more important on both sides, the EU became continued to be ever more open to the world, open to China, and a fierce promoter of open science. But with China's new geopolitical assertiveness and geostrategic ambitions, the EU came to realize that it had perhaps been a bit naive and labeled China from its most important partner in 2018 to a system rival in 2019. And since 2020, with the new so-called geopolitical commission of President von der Leyen, it sets the agenda for collaboration under the label of strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy, a tool of union policy limiting specific actions to strictly member states only in the EU's strategic interest. It's reducing its openness, it seems to be seeking a new balance between freedom, openness, and security. And the motto changed to as open as possible, as closed as necessary. At the end of last year, I already mentioned it, it signed the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. So the question is, are we going back to a trade framework also for research and development and higher ed? Well, maybe in some sense, and that has all to do with China's successes, notably in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, math. So let's have a quick look at that. Very much from what we found and reported in our book. China's research publication output and its share in the top 10 highly cited scientific publications increased tenfold this century. And that has been more at the expense of the US share than of the EU, which remained mostly at the same level. We see an increase not only in publications, but also in international collaborative publications, mostly still with the US, North America, and the European region, and predominantly in STEM. A very unbalanced situation, not only because, as we know, and as was also discussed on Tuesday, the conditions in China for research in the STEM fields compared to social science and humanities can be very different. Different rates of academic freedom, different funding levels, different rate of international involvement. But also in the China-EU relationship, the STEM bias is very, very dominant in these co-authored publications, as we have seen, but also in the research mobility, and in, for instance, the joint master's degrees. 2/3 of all of that is happening in those fields. The relationship is unbalanced anyhow in terms of flows, of people, students and researchers, but also in flows of funding. So has this strategy of China, its geopolitical strategy called the New Silk Road, is it just another layer of university networking? What is it? What is its significance, and what is its significance for this EU-China relationship? Well, in a way, it's just another layer, because more than 50% of the contacts were established already before this was launched. But it's extending, 66 countries, now perhaps more, but only some 18% in Europe. And it has a broader focus than STEM, more fields like economics and transport and law. And it becomes more China-led, China-initiated. China's universities more in the lead, and also more under the control by the ministry. Much tighter control of these partnerships, much more meant to be adding to China's capacity, and certainly avoiding it to be detrimental to its educational sovereignty, as it's also called on that side. We have made some comparisons. To some extent, it can be compared with the Europeanization of higher education. There's some similarities in instruments, but there are also significant differences, of course. More top-down, more led by state ideology than the bottom-up, and more pluralistic views on the ID identity. And important difference, China's approach is bilateral, whereas the EU's approach is always multilateral. An important aspect of this new Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative is, as I already mentioned, the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, where the bilateral agreements can be challenging for the unity of the Union, indeed. And in particular, Hungary, which I think we know because it banned the Central European University in 2018, and it welcomed a branch campus of Fudan University in 2020. There's an interesting piece of legislation that came out also recently by the European Court of Justice on this expelling of the Central European University by the Hungarian government. And it ruled that it was incompatible with EU law, notably the articles on academic freedom in the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union, but also incompatible with GATS, the Global Agreement on Trade and Services under the WTO, incompatible with the services commitments of free movement. Important case law, we think, expected to set precedent and strengthen, hopefully, the academic protections across Europe, but it may also bring GATS and the WTO back on the stage. What we've also seen is shifting flows globally. I think we have already observed some stagnation in the outflow of Chinese students prior to the pandemic, but certainly following that. But important also, China becoming an importer of international students, although that's mostly from these Belt and Road countries and still mostly at lower degree levels. But very importantly, I think the return of a lot of its diaspora from abroad, with very often advanced degrees from very strong Western universities, and quite often substantial research experience. So this may post-COVID actually enable China to capitalize not only on its sustained investments in higher education, but also on this return of the diaspora, even more so because it is expected to recover faster than the West. The OECD forecast 8% economic growth in China in 2021. So there's another challenge to the competitive edge that Europe has over China in certain fields of research. So are we seeing a kind of a Sputnik effect? Notably, for instance, the fact that China launched the first quantum encrypted satellite in space, or landed on the dark side of the moon. Yes, I think this is that kind of an effect. We have seen China perhaps too long as the sleeping lion. Its growth, especially in STEM fields, has perhaps gone unnoticed for a while. In Europe, we were certainly looking westwards, more to the US, and perhaps very much building, perhaps very much looking inwards, building the European research area and the higher education area. But gradually, some concerns came up. Here you see some reports from the UK and the US, notably, over, for instance, the activities of Huawei, fueling also quite some nationalist speak and political response, and coming more and more also to affect the discussion about the EU and China relationship very much. So the growing concerns are also felt here, notably in collaboration in areas where China is really taking the lead. I'm looking here at the at its share of papers in artificial intelligence. Notably, they're not only because it's taking the lead, but also because it may be used again in non-civic purposes, so-called dual use, for instance, against minorities, infringing human rights. There are concerns about research ethics, integrity, academic freedom, protection of IPR, privacy in data exchange, data security and reciprocity in data access. And colleagues from Australia have looked in a quite detailed way in where Chinese research may be related to its defense, military, and how it relates to universities in the West. Interesting networks across the different fields. So for Europe, then, very much the question is, in respect to this open science ideal, how open can it be? And I would say we should not confuse geopolitics with academic work which is based on mutual trust and exercised in an open and transparent global science system. And in the European discussion, I think that European universities have always also made it very clear that the EU, that expects the European Commission to play a role in rebalancing cooperation with China, making it more sustainable by leveling the playing field and by mitigating risk. But how can Europe do that? That's a complicated question, because Europe has only a very limited competency, as it's called, a legal force, a competency in education. As I said, it's mainly the domain of the member states, and they continue to claim that. It has a stronger competency in research, a so-called shared competency, but the strongest competency it has is in trade, where alone it's able to legislate both internally and externally. Of course, the parliaments adopt and have to ratify, but still it's a very strong regulator in that domain. And it is using, that's why I was asking, is trade coming back into the picture? Yes, it seems so. First of all, for instance, the EU expanded powers to block Chinese, but also US companies from Horizon Europe. Well, that was still under the research competency, that it was doing that in October last year. But now it is also launching, still in a drafting stage, but compliance guidance for research involving dual use. Also looking at how in the HR research award labels, it can introduce guidelines to increase the awareness of foreign interference, as it's called. And it's not only vis-a-vis China, as I already mentioned. Very interestingly, University of Amsterdam rector called on the European Commission also for securing universities as independent education and research institutions vis-a-vis big tech companies in the US. So what we're seeing is that universities ask the EU to protect them against both foreign interference by surveillance states, China, or threats from surveillance capitalism. In this case, the US big tech companies. And this is detailed, but still, I think it's very, very important to look at this, how this may play out. The dual-use export control that the EU, the European Commission is proposing, how does that relate to human rights and academic freedom? Well, first of all, universities may be expected to adopt and implement internal compliance programs. And the guidelines, and I read from them, say academic freedom is a fundamental right guaranteed in the Charter, the European Charter. However, not exempting research and research organizations from complying with regulations established to safeguard security interests of the EU and of its member states. So we are looking now to a range of questions, but we are trying to explore here with my colleagues in the law school, like how will the EU's mandate to facilitate convergence in dual use export, how will they work out with human rights and fundamental freedoms in the field of higher education? How will academic freedom be affected in Europe? How will teaching be and collaborative research be affected? What will the obligation to exercise human rights due diligence affect universities as exporters? And these three areas of three levels of competencies, how will they work out in the higher education sectors? And probably another important one, based or underlying this is, are these values and freedoms that the EU is defending, how are these externally understood? And are they sufficiently coherent, understood within the EU? And I have an important footnote here. There was an interesting piece of research published by colleagues Youngblood, Maassen, and Elken on academic values in the European higher education area. 48 countries, as you know. And they noted that differences between countries on such values as academic freedom and institutional autonomy, the differences are increasing since 2010. And especially the non-EU member states are responsible for this negative trend. And so these authors posed the question, should the European higher education area be brought back to a smaller set of countries who really adhere to these European values, or should it go global? That's an interesting, not legal, but related question. So clearly, Europe is facing a review of its openness, rethinking its open borders. Maybe we have taken freedom and security too much for granted. Its openness is being challenged. We have to find a new balance and face consequences for academic freedom and international cooperation and mobility, but should not be distracted in our mission as universities. I would say at the contrary. This is, as our Chinese colleagues also say, this is not the time to be silent. History shows that we share the same values, broadly the same values and objectives. And we think that scientific cooperation should be continued with China. It's exactly the way to respond to rising tensions, but also to make sure it is exercised in an open and transparent way. Universities have a distinct role in society, especially where governments are less effective in sustaining the global common good, as also Jerry Postiglione emphasized on Tuesday, in achieving social development goals. They have an inherently international agenda, so they have to speak out. This is an example of Harvard's President Bakov, who affirmed academic freedom in a speech in Peking University, and had tea with President Xi afterward. I think we should also be very vigilant in the West, in Europe, about the nationalist responses that come from this discussion and that may provoke government interventions that actually jeopardize institutional autonomy and academic freedom in our own universities, measures for which we criticize China. I think we should also acknowledge our knowledge gap about China and realize that this requires a global rather than a purely Eurocentric perspective in teaching our students. Let's think about the disciplines that mostly shape the human mind. How do we teach history? How open is the young European mind to the world? I think, and there I also completely agree with Jerry, who said, I think, that this kind of antagonistic frames and call to a rhetoric, I think he said it is lazy and unhelpful. I agree, and unfortunately, it is also present in and around higher education. But we have to realize that that kind of speak inspires worldviews of no use in educating the next generation. That generation will have to solve global challenges together because they are global. And I think that requires empathy, which I think is an effective as well as a cognitive capability. And the question is, do we provide for that? Do we help students to develop themselves in that sense? And how? And is that enough? And I would close with a quote from Noam Chomsky, who said that recently, end of last year, that beyond this pandemic, the three most important existential threats to humanity are global warming, nuclear war, and a deteriorating democracy. But he added that internationalism and an engaged and educated population are the only hope for dealing in these major crises. And he said it's feasible. And I think I agree. Engaged, but engaged is more than educated in terms of having the knowledge. International solidarity is necessary to progress. Empathy, indeed. Thank you.
And thank you, Marijk. And I think your closing statements were compelling, and it draws attention to the importance not only of knowledge and information about higher education and research, but of the meta stance we take, the overall perspective we bring to things, and not just in woolly rhetoric, but in terms of concrete guidelines for action and cooperation. And you've given us really substantial ethical framework to work with, I think. So your paper will repay reviewing and reconsideration as the months proceed. You've asked me to comment on your paper, and I just want to draw attention to a small number of points before we go into the Q&A, where I see our colleague Catherine Montgomery and as among others is already putting forward some interesting views. First, that era is over. The era of 500 years of European centrality in the world is not going to continue. And by saying that, we say Europe and America together are no longer going to be as dominant as they were. And this point has been made many, many times, but I think it's now coming to clear realization. We're seeing many manifestations of the quite rapid shift going on in the balance of the world, with East Asia and South Asia especially becoming important, but with a number of middle powers emerging around the world as well, like Brazil and Iran and so on, which are no longer controlled by the major powers in the way they once were. So out of the Euro-American centric world into a new world. And I take the Martin Jacques point that I think you cite, Marijk, that unless North Americans, Europeans, English-speaking countries start to understand East and South and Southeast Asia in their own terms, we will increasingly be incompetent to deal with this emerging world. The our Chinese colleagues have been under pressure for 2 generations to adapt and adjust to a North American, especially, understanding of higher education, and have done that very successfully in many respects. The boot is now coming onto the other foot, and we are all in the position of needing to understand and to orientate to emerging Asia. And the learning the other way will continue. Asia will need to understand Europe and America, and as well as vice versa, but we're now in a much more symmetrical world. Multipolar, not bipolar. And I think that's the logical consequence of the Westphalian world played out in the post-colonial era. You know, a situation where the great powers no longer completely dominate the middle and smaller powers, that, and there's potential for middle and smaller powers to gain in relative importance on a world stage. And we've seen that in science and in higher education clearly, with the emergence of new players having quite a lot of weight in the world system, even while the established players in North America and Europe remain very important as well. So it's not always zero sum, and we are seeing an emergence of a multipolar world as a decisive fact. Thirdly, this means the work of individual scholars and groups coming from outside the Euro-American zone will become increasingly important. We'll need to take more note of what's going on everywhere. And you think of higher education studies, you think of the contribution of the Shanghai Jiaotong Graduate School of Education, which developed the Shanghai ranking, the first global ranking. That was an early sign of the capacity of our colleagues outside Europe and North America to play a world leading role in thinking about social science. And this will happen in all disciplines increasingly, and it's already happening, of course, in many natural and physical science areas. Models also, models of higher education systems and models of institutions will become more plural as well. I don't think so much the Chinese model of the university is exportable. It's more kind of nested in the party state regime in China and doesn't transfer easily into other jurisdictions. But I do think that the state-driven system approach is now a significant counterweight to the quasi-market deregulation, spend less and get the families to pay more kind of Anglo-American approach to higher education. So I think, you know, that the neoliberal model has been really dominant as a world model, but it hasn't become universal. It's never been universal in Europe. And most European countries don't fully subscribe to it. Some are quite a long way away from it. But it has been the major driver, perhaps, of reforms in emerging countries. Well, I think we're now in a situation where the state-driven model is clearly creating dividends, you know, for East Asian university systems in particular, with the rise of science. And I think increasingly that model starts to become more and more attractive to emerging countries as they build. And the crunch is going to come when the attractiveness of the state-driven model, say in a country like India, you know, where there's always an interest in state-driven approaches. When that comes into conflict, though, with the neoliberal economic settings in India, and this is the problem that all the state-driven model will face when it's outside East Asia, you have to be willing to pay for it. And some countries are going to do that and some won't. But, you know, the mix of a state-driven intent and a neoliberal financing base isn't going to work. That's going to create a fundamental problem. And it already has in India, which is perhaps the best example of the dilemma. India will need to move one way or the other. It'll have to move to sacrifice its capacity to build a strong national approach to science and higher education, or it will need to reverse the neoliberal approach and start financing higher education and science properly. That's a choice that India faces, but all countries are in a similar position in a sense. Fifth, the international space. I think the international space, which has been remarkably free in many respects in higher education, is likely to come under pressure to be more regulated in future. And we're already seeing that with the way that the Sino-American conflict at a geopolitical level is playing out in American attempts to restrict and contain and control what universities and scientists are doing with China. And there's been very pronounced intervention, and the Australians are doing the same. So I think that's the beginning of a whole set of things ways in which governments are going to seek to regulate the international mobility and international flows and international cooperation in our sector. I would say further, though, that I think universities will be better at collaborating and more willing to collaborate across borders than governments will in future. And universities may well turn out to become an important, if you like, open space, positive space for continuing discussion between countries and civilizations, which increasingly seem to be both interdependent, you know, more closely poised together, but also in conflict, also very aware of their differences. I think for that reason, perhaps devising a common protocol on academic freedom, which I think we could all agree on, might be a very, very important move that we can start to make across borders into East Asia and in the highway between East Asia and the United States and Europe. I think we can all agree on the importance of academic freedom in knowledge and in teaching as well as research. And it would be, I think, good if the academic professions everywhere were able to develop a more rather than less robust identity at a time when they're going to come under greater pressure. I think at this point, Marijk, I should stop and bring in some of our discussion. Can I go to Catherine Montgomery first? And I'll get to the rest of the call list after that. Catherine.
Hi, thank you, Marijk. Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation. I was just raising the fact there's quite an interesting piece of research by Fry et al., and I can paste the paper into the chat, which looks at the scientific research teams and how they're shrinking and becoming less international during the pandemic. They only looked at COVID research, but the big players were still dominant in that research, China, the States and the UK. But the patterns and directions of networks changed and there were fewer partners from the global south. And I just wondered what you thought about how these, obviously we have the crisis of COVID at the moment, but we have other crises facing us in the future, climate change. You know, do you think that, you know, international collaboration and international research teams might become more national? You know, for all the reasons that I've just outlined, or do you think the need for international collaboration, because this would be a bad thing, wouldn't it? If crises make us shrink in, the very thing that we need is we're not doing it. So you know, I think it's quite an important paper that.
Simon, do you want me to respond?
Yes, please. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you're giving the pointing to the answer yourself, and I think COVID has actually proven how important it is to collaborate internationally, not only sharing the data, but also finding the solutions. Of course, more than ever. And I think Chomsky is right. I mean, the further challenges are perhaps even bigger and will require even more cooperation. And yes, the Global South has to be involved. I recognize I didn't include that in my talk because it was about the Eurasian relationship. But you know, this comment I probably made a bit on the side, that Europe has to understand its history better. That has to do with the Global South, of course. And I think there's a lot of things that need to be rethought also concerning the role that China now is playing in, for instance, Africa, notably, but not exclusively. But also in the more ideological side of the conversation. Of course, there's a lot of criticism on and a reluctance and fear even, I think, in Europe for China's soft power. But we need to understand our own role and our own kinds of soft power, contemporary and historical, and you know, to really have an open conversation and understand these things. And I think it requires a new kind of academic dialogue. I want to avoid debate, dialogue, and that's why I was referring to empathy, because I think that is a really, you know, capability. I would say that you need to to make progress in a conversation together. And it sounds very soft. I know. But I think our students would immensely benefit from that. They have to find solutions to these challenges together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Hongwei Gu, Hongwei.
Thank you, Marijk, for this insightful talk. I would like to ask, how are the Russian and Chinese-led visions for Eurasian higher education regionalism developing in Central Asia? And to what extent do these visions overlap? Yeah.
Good question, thank you. Well, we have in the book that I think there was a reference to it in the chat. There's a special chapter written in the book about exactly this by our Russian colleagues, a Russian and a Chinese colleague who wrote that chapter together. And that was really very helpful because, yeah, a lot of the countries in Central Asia have been, of course, for a long time, during the Soviet regime, being part of that ideological sphere, and may now be more influenced by China. And yeah, there are different constellations. There are cultural, ethnical, and language shifts going on. That is definitely an important part of what China envisaged in this new Silk Road or Belt and Road initiative. And we shouldn't forget that I think it's primarily an economic initiative. It has to do with infrastructure, geographic lines, but also with labor and the demography. China needs much more young skilled labor. So is also looking in especially countries in Central Asia, how it can help build up the higher education systems there. And from that, eventually draw more skilled labor to China or to the Chinese capacity to generate economic growth in and around. Yeah.
But as you mentioned, China needs young skilled labor. But the population in China, there's so much old people there. There wasn't any young skilled labor there now.
But this is one of the drivers of China's internationalization policy, if you like. And there is a lot of similarity with some of the rationales that Europe has. You know, Europe also needed labor market mobility, and for that more internationalization, more language learning, and so there are similarities in that respect.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And thank you, Hongwei. Our next question comes from Victorita Triff.
Hi, this is Victorita Triff from the University of Bucharest. Thank you, Simon. Congratulations, Marijk, for your presentation. Beyond the various complications and dissimilarities on the issue, are important some projects, political projects, educational projects, economic projects, and social projects. In this context, it is possible to assume a single education space in Eurasia relations. For example, graduate students in case of social projects. Thank you.
So your question is whether it's we could envisage a higher education space across Eurasia?
It is possible to cover by a denominator, common denominator, the entire educational space.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And that relates, that's why I was citing the paper by Jungblut and Jensen. no, Jungblut and Maassen, sorry, about the probably divergence we see within the current European higher education area on when it comes to academic values, probably between more the EU member states and the other members, and whether to push forward and globalize it or to withdraw in a way and to centralize and to concentrate on Europe. I think Simon also commented on this, and I would like to give back to him. And would just mention there is important work on in this territory going on by the Observatory of the Magna Carta Universitates, who after the fall of the wall in 1889 was some 10 years after it was established, the Magna Carta, by a group of some 100 European rectors. And in their statement in the Magna Carta, it is precisely about these academic values. And I know that the president of the observatory and his board are exactly working on this. Can this be more globalized? And that means, I think, be more inclusive. That could be an approach. Simon?
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to bring in David Law at the stage. David, are you there? David Law. Hello, David.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was on mute. Okay, so thank you. I'm a historian. Thank you very much for an excellent talk, by the way. I'm a historian, and my concern is whether Chinese universities are going to easily to be able to develop academic freedom, given the history of Chinese universities. Unlike Europe, as I'm sure colleagues in this meeting know well, Chinese universities can't trace their roots back much more than a century. And so whilst there are individual traditions of dissent and opposition and freedom and all the rest of it, there's no institutional tradition of academic freedom in China. I'm wondering how much of a difference does this make?
Well, first of all, I think we thank you, David, for your point. I think we should be very nuanced there. If you ask your Chinese colleagues about academic freedom and they work in the STEM fields, they will say, well, probably more than you have in the West. And in a sense, they're right. I mean, there are lots of ethical guidelines that avoid that we're doing certain types of research or certain types of research on a certain scale, which are possible in China. So that depends very much on, first of all, your definition, and secondly, on your field. But of course, we know what we're talking about in certain fields of social science and humanities. This may be more restricted, and that's also the field where we see less international collaboration, but that is not specifically Chinese. That is globally the case. So I think that there is almost no obstacle really in terms of fundamental research and in STEM. And looking at these guidelines that the European Commission is suggesting, let me put it that way, fundamental research is excluded. So we're talking about very thin lines. And last point, tradition. How many Chinese are in China academics, but trained in the West, or very, very strongly connected and collaborating with the West? So, you know, I don't think we can see it as an isolated system, but our Chinese colleagues in the team with whom we made the book also confirmed that, you know, the differences in values play out more in social science and humanities still.
Marijk, we're nearly the end, but I've got a final question I'd like to pose for you. The question from the chair, if you like. I mean, this is the difficult question of conditionalities attached to agreements with China. And I mean, there's I think a growing appetite for attaching requirements in relation to, say, human rights to agreements. The political systems, of course, are very different. And the separation between the state, the market, civil society, the university, that's normal in the West is not apparent in China. So if, in that sense, in a kind of perverse way, there's something in the American argument that says when you're dealing with any Chinese university, you're dealing directly with the party state. It's true that universities are more nested in the party state, if you like. Does that mean that it's desirable or feasible to, when you're negotiating with, say, Shanghai Jiao Tong University, to hold it accountable or responsible in some way for what happens in Xinjiang, for example, or Tibet? I mean, to what extent is it reasonable to combine these different issues when negotiating higher education agreements, and to what extent is it feasible to separate them in the context of an integrated political system like China?
Well, that's the question, and that was in this line of what would it mean that we have to do due diligence on human rights with our Chinese partners? I was thinking that, okay, indeed, I'm a guest professor in Shanghai Jiao Tong, so my colleague there is, if he has a senior position in university, he's likely to be a member of the Communist Party. That is the state. That is now good. So does it stop there? Well, I will say from my European and liberal point of view, I would say I'm not asking a Dutch or German or British or whoever colleague either about what's your membership, political party or church, and taking it from there to being a collaborator and researcher. And I mean, to a large extent, we think those things are separated. And I know that the university and the state have a different relationship than here. But still, I think I would not go as far as to, no, it would go against my liberal values and upbringing, I guess, to mix these things up.
Yeah, but of course that's our system, isn't it? That's how we think.
Yes, I know. That's my logic.
Make those separations. I mean, but maybe it's the question of responsibility that's the problem too. You know, the idea that an accountability, and maybe that's what we need to think about. It's also being different from country to country. I mean, the thing you notice about China is centralized control, but immense devolution as well. You know, and otherwise, how do you coordinate such a huge country successfully? In many respects, you know, you have to allow a great deal of grassroots autonomy.
Exactly.
And so in that circumstance, we should be able to recognize that autonomy exists, even though it doesn't take the form of autonomous responsibility.
You can't take the individual and the state. I mean, the Netherlands, let me take, it's always better to give an example of your own country, right? Yes. The Netherlands has some very lenient tax regulations. See, what if I am asked and approached by somebody from another country saying, oh, so you're that country that allows multinationals, hey, hang on, that's not me.
Yes,
so I think, sorry, and let alone that about the past. I mean, my country has an enormous colonial history, and we're still getting to grips with it. We're not done yet. But that is, as you say, it's not the same as a personal responsibility. And well, we know this in Europe very well. But my point is that I think we need to support our students in developing the kind of thinking and the kind of dialogue that avoids a retreat in your own ideological bubble. Be open.
Yes, it's not just the national container we have to avoid, it's the civilizational container now. That, I mean, there's a very nice book by Bruno Mackay which talks about Eurasia as a concept, and he makes the argument that never has the world been so globalized, so interdependent, so pushed together, and also that greater interdependence, that greater convergence at world level is also accompanied by sharp awareness of civilizational differences, different perspectives. And so instead of these different perspectives being at different ends of Eurasia or the world, they're now really in conjunction, dealing with each other all the time. So We haven't got the 1990s globalization where it was all seemed to be under an Anglo-American blanket. We've now got this multipolar globalization where everyone's together and everyone's different, and it's dealing with that and developing the machinery to deal with that at a governance level is what we have to find now.
Yeah, but we took it for granted in our idea of globalization, which was indeed the Western and neoliberal logic as we coin it now, of open borders, open trade, open internet for economic growth. Meanwhile, we have taken security and freedom for granted because that was under the big umbrella of mostly the US. And what we're seeing now is that we're rebalancing, and we have to rethink, you know, freedom and security, even without, doesn't take China into the equation necessarily, because it's already within the West when it concerns who controls our data, to who we are visible, and all these things. So I think that's a very fundamental phase we're going through. And yes, there are different. China definitely has a different view on globalization. It's very pro-globalization, but it has a preference for economic growth and security over freedom and openness. That's clear.
The old assumptions were premised on, you know, the world becoming more westernized, and that's not going to happen. Not in the form.
No, China is not becoming more Western. China is becoming more China. It's also Martin Jacques who said that. Yeah. But it depends on, I think in the EU-China relationship, it's also about the institutional side of things. How is the normative pillar, if you like, so the things that are where values and freedom are very central, and what's more in the charter of the European Union, and how is that going to be balanced with the regulatory side of things? So, and are they indeed going to be mostly dealt with under trade? Okay, the Digital Services Act, etc. This is all mostly under the trade side. How are they going to be balanced, and over what platforms? And then the US is always there as well. That's why I said you can't see it apart from that. Take the WTO. It may become more important again, but the current government, the current Biden administration is still blocking the WTO.
It seems to me that in the situation where the world is both clearly different and closely engaged, and where, I mean, on one hand, each civilizational bloc needs to sustain its own identity and develop its own identity. It doesn't need to give ground on anything fundamental, and that means assumptions about internal freedoms, for example, in Western countries are really important to sustain. But the other thing that needs to happen is that work needs to progress on if you like, the cross-civilizational machinery, the global machinery, and points where agreement can be secured. It seems to me identifying where in a polarized situation, agreement is possible and can be used as a platform to move forward from. That's really crucial. And at the moment, apart from climate change, there's no real initiatives going on. So the WTO remains, you know, perhaps the unifying framework at the moment, for what it's worth. Nothing is happening in the larger area of governance beyond trade, though. But anyway, we better stop because we're way past our time. But it's a really interesting discussion. Really value your contribution to it, not only with us, but with everyone. And what you're doing is really important. So all power to that. And we welcome you back in the future to discuss these issues again. Your insight into China and the West simultaneously is extraordinarily valuable, I think. And, you know, it's people with that kind of bicultural awareness that at the moment that are really crucial. Our next webinar, colleagues, takes us to the combined space of India and the United States. We welcome back Shailendra Raj Mehta, who's going to talk to us about governance in the United States from an Indian perspective. He's going to talk about the role of alumni in governance, and he's going to make an argument under the provocative heading, why are US universities so good? ? Well, that was you could look on that as a shameless attempt to build an audience for the webinar in North America. But certainly, as we know from what Shailendra did for us last time, he will produce a very well-reasoned and interesting webinar next Tuesday. So be there for that webinar, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.